The little black girl reached the biker near the observatory stairs as someone watched her from a science wing. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. The sun was beginning to set behind the distant hills, casting a soft, golden glow across the campus of the local university. It was a peaceful evening, but for one little girl, peace was a far-off dream. Her name was Aisha, and she was no more than 10 years old, yet her small frame carried the weight of a world too big for her. Her eyes darted nervously around, scanning the surroundings near the observatory stairs as she took cautious steps. Her breath came out in uneven gasps, her heart racing. She had been running for what felt like hours, but it was not the physical exhaustion that drained her. It was the fear, the kind of fear a child should never have to know. As Aisha looked over her shoulder, she could feel the weight of someone's gaze upon her. She couldn't see them, but she knew someone was watching from the science wing above. The silhouette of a person, hidden in the shadows, made her stomach twist in dread. She had to act quickly. There was no time to waste. Without a second thought, she rushed toward the group of bikers standing near the bottom of the stairs. The leather jackets and the rumbling of their engines were a stark contrast to the calmness of the university campus. But to Aisha, they were her only hope. With shaky hands, she reached the nearest biker, a tall man whose leather vest bore the insignia of the Thunderwolves Motorcycle Club. He was busy talking to another member, but when he saw the look of terror in Aisha's eyes, he immediately stopped. "Please, you have to help me," she said, her voice quivering as she grabbed his sleeve. "They're after me. They've been watching me. I don't know what to do." The biker's eyes softened. He had seen his fair share of danger, but the fear in this child's eyes was something different, something that tugged at his heart. He looked at his fellow bikers, then back at Aisha. "You're safe now," he said, his deep voice filled with determination. "Tell us what's going on." As Aisha explained, the bikers listened intently. She told them about how she had been followed by someone from the science wing, someone who had been watching her for days. She didn't know who they were, but she knew they meant harm. The biker who had spoken to her, known as Forge, turned to the others. "We don't let anyone harm a child," he said firmly. The group of bikers immediately sprang into action. Some of them went to their bikes, while others moved toward the nearby building, ready to investigate. Forge knelt down to Aisha's level and placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We're not going anywhere until you're safe," he promised. As the bikers prepared to handle the situation, Aisha felt a small flicker of hope ignite inside her. For the first time that day, she believed someone would protect her. She didn't know what the bikers would do or how they would handle the situation, but she knew one thing for sure: she was no longer alone. The thought brought some comfort, though she still couldn't shake the feeling that whoever was watching her wasn't far behind. The tension in the air thickened, and Aisha could feel it. Something big was about to happen. She could only pray that the bikers would be enough to protect her, to keep her safe from whatever dangers lay ahead. The moment hung in the balance, and as the sun dipped below the horizon, the night's challenges began to unfold. I heard the sound of engines roaring to life. Forge looked up, his eyes narrowing as he surveyed the horizon. The moment had come. The tension was palpable, and Aisha could feel it in the pit of her stomach. She had never imagined her life would lead her to this point, standing in front of a group of bikers, waiting for them to save her from an unknown threat. The bikers were ready. Some revved their motorcycles, while others began to scan the area, their eyes sharp and focused. Forge stood in front of her, like a protective wall. "We're not going to let anyone hurt you," he promised, his voice low and steady. The group of bikers, the Thunderwolves, were about to embark on a journey that could change everything. As Forge looked at Aisha, he remembered the promise he had made 5 years ago to her father. Tyrone Jenkins had been his best friend, a fellow soldier who had saved his life during a mission in Afghanistan. Tyrone had asked him, with his last breath, to look after his little girl, to make sure she was safe. Forge never forgot that promise, and now, with the girl standing before him, he was about to make good on it. The urgency in Aisha's voice had not been lost on him. She was in danger, and it was up to him and his crew to make sure no harm came to her. "Let's go," Forge said, his voice cutting through the air. With that, the bikers mounted their motorcycles, the rumble of the engines vibrating the ground beneath their feet. They formed a tight group, each rider positioned in a strategic spot. The engines growled in unison, creating a sound that was unmistakable, the sound of a group united, ready for whatever lay ahead. As the bikers moved out, Aisha felt her heart race. She wasn't sure what they were about to face, but the sight of the bikers, their leather vests and tattoos, filled her with a sense of security she had never known. They weren't just a group of men and women on motorcycles. They were her protectors now. She had always been afraid, alone, but now she had a team, a family. Aisha glanced over at Forge as they began to ride. His face was grim, focused. She could tell that the promise he had made to her father was something he took seriously. This wasn't just about protecting a little girl. This was about honoring a bond forged in the heat of battle, a bond that had survived the test of time. They rode through the dark streets, the sound of their bikes cutting through the silence of the night. The wind whipped against Aisha's face as she clutched onto the back of Forge's bike, trying to steady her nerves. She had been through so much already, but now, with every passing mile, she felt safer. It was as if the world was slowing down, and all she had to do was follow the bikers. They were her lifeline. The group continued through the city, the buildings becoming fewer and fewer as they moved farther out into the outskirts. The roads were winding, unfamiliar, but Forge and his crew knew exactly where they were headed. They were closing in on the place where Aisha's stalker was believed to be hiding. The plan was simple: find the person responsible for following Aisha, confront them, and make sure they would never hurt her again. But as they neared their destination, something didn't feel right. Forge could sense it. The atmosphere had shifted, and he could see it in the faces of the other bikers. They were all on high alert. "Keep your eyes open," Forge instructed. "We don't know what we're walking into." As they turned a corner, they saw it. A black SUV parked near a dimly lit building. A man stood by the vehicle, his back turned. It was him, the stalker. Forge signaled for the group to stop. The bikers came to a halt, their engines dying down as they surveyed the scene. Aisha's heart pounded in her chest as she saw the figure in the distance. The man she had been running from. The man who had been watching her every move. "Stay close," Forge said, his voice calm but firm. He knew this was the moment. The moment they would either bring an end to the nightmare or risk losing everything. Aisha watched as the bikers moved into position. Each one was in sync, each one knowing their role. They were professionals, and they were ready. Forge moved forward, his eyes locked on the stalker. He wasn't going to let this man hurt Aisha, not on his watch. The man turned slowly, his eyes widening as he saw the group of bikers. His hand reached for something inside his coat, but it was too late. Forge had already made his move. In a flash, he was on him, his hand grabbing the man's wrist before he could pull out whatever weapon he had hidden. "You're not going anywhere," Forge said, his voice low and threatening. The man struggled, but he was no match for the biker. Forge had seen enough in his life to know how to deal with threats. He was trained for this. The other bikers circled around, making sure there were no other surprises. Aisha watched, her breath caught in her throat, as Forge subdued the man. The tension in the air was thick, but it was over. The stalker was in custody, and Aisha was safe, for now. The bikers stood in silence for a moment, each of them processing what had just happened. It was over, but the feeling of danger still hung in the air. Forge turned to Aisha, offering her a small smile. "You're safe now," he said. Aisha felt a weight lift from her shoulders. She had made it through the night, thanks to the bikers who had answered her call. But as they prepared to leave, one thing lingered in Aisha's mind. The stalker might be gone, but the shadows still followed her. I stood still for a moment, the weight of the situation sinking in. The man who had been watching Aisha was now in the hands of the bikers, but something about the way he looked at them, and at Aisha, sent a chill down my spine. It wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Forge, who had been the one to take control of the situation, looked at the others and gave a subtle nod. It was time to move. They'd captured the stalker, but there was more at play here than just a random man following a child. Aisha's safety wasn't guaranteed yet. She had run, she had sought help, but this wasn't just about a man in a parking lot. Something larger, something darker was happening. Forge could feel it too. He'd seen too much in his life, lived through too many situations to think this was a coincidence. As the bikers pulled away from the scene, the tension was still thick in the air. The streetlights flickered overhead, casting long shadows over the road. The sound of the motorcycles was the only thing that broke the silence, the rumbling engines cutting through the night. Aisha sat behind Forge, her small frame trembling slightly. She didn't speak, but her grip on him tightened. He glanced back at her, offering a reassuring smile, though inside he was anything but calm. He knew this was far from over. As they rode, the streets grew quieter, more desolate. Forge checked the rearview mirror, scanning for any sign that they were being followed. Nothing. But that didn't mean they were safe. The world didn't work like that. "You're okay?" Forge said, his voice low and steady, trying to calm Aisha. She nodded, though her eyes were still wide with fear. She hadn't let go of the grip on his jacket. She wasn't ready to trust the world again. She wasn't ready to believe that she was safe, no matter how many bikers surrounded her. The night had already taken too much from her. They reached an old, weathered motel on the edge of town. Forge signaled for the group to stop. The motorcycles rolled to a halt in unison, the sounds of the engines dying down one by one. Aisha looked around, her eyes wide as she took in her surroundings. The motel was small, a rundown building with faded neon lights and a sign that looked like it hadn't been replaced in years. It wasn't much, but it was safe, for now. "We'll stay here for the night," Forge said, his voice carrying a sense of finality. "We'll keep watch." The bikers dismounted, each one moving with purpose. Some headed to the front office to secure rooms, while others began to patrol the area. It was a quiet town, but that didn't mean they weren't at risk. Forge took a moment to check in with the others, making sure they had everything they needed before walking over to Aisha. "You'll be safe here," he said, offering a small smile. She didn't respond immediately, but after a few moments, she nodded. "Thank you," she whispered. It was a simple phrase, but for Forge, it meant everything. He had kept his promise to her father, and now he was keeping it to her. But something about the whole situation felt off. The stalker's capture was too easy, the timing too perfect. Forge couldn't shake the feeling that they had walked right into a trap. He glanced over at the others, his mind racing. He had to be sure. Nothing would stop him from keeping Aisha safe. The door to the motel room creaked as it opened, and the bikers filtered inside, one by one. Forge followed Aisha in, but he wasn't ready to settle down. He moved toward the window and looked out into the night. The stillness outside was unnerving. It was the calm before the storm, and he could feel it in his bones. As the night wore on, the group remained on high alert. Forge and the other bikers stayed close, watching for any sign that something wasn't right. Aisha had fallen asleep, her head resting against the pillow, but Forge couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still watching. The stalker was just the beginning. He knew that much for sure. Somewhere out there, someone else was pulling the strings, and Forge wasn't about to let them get away. The silence of the night was broken by a sharp knock at the door. Forge's hand instinctively moved to the handle of the gun tucked under his jacket, but he didn't draw it. Not yet. He looked through the peephole and saw a shadow standing outside. It was a man, and from the look of him, he wasn't here to make friends. Forge opened the door slowly, his muscles tense, ready for whatever came next. The man standing before him was tall, with dark, cold eyes. He wore a suit, though it seemed out of place in a rundown motel. "I need to speak with you," the man said, his voice calm, but there was a dangerous edge to it. Forge didn't say anything at first. He just stared at the man, trying to read him. Finally, he spoke. "What do you want?" The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he glanced over his shoulder, checking the surroundings before stepping inside. "There's more to this than you realize," he said, his voice low and filled with warning. "If you think the stalker was the only threat, you're wrong. There's someone else, someone much bigger than you're prepared for." The door clicked shut behind him, and Forge's heart skipped a beat. This was only the beginning. The door clicked shut behind the stranger, and Forge stood frozen for a moment. His hand, which had been resting on the handle of the gun under his jacket, slowly relaxed, but his mind was racing. The man before him wasn't just anyone. He was well-dressed, out of place in this rundown motel, and the coldness in his eyes told Forge everything he needed to know. This was serious. Aisha, still asleep in the corner, remained unaware of the conversation happening just a few feet away. Forge kept his voice low, but his words were sharp. Who the hell are you? The man's lips curled into a faint, unsettling smile. I'm someone who knows what's coming next. He paused, letting the words settle in the air. And it's not going to be pretty. Forge wasn't sure whether to believe him, but the man's presence and his confident tone were enough to make him cautious. You've been following us, Forge said, his voice now colder. You know more than you're letting on. The man stepped closer, his eyes scanning the room. He seemed to weigh his words carefully, as if he knew Forge wouldn't take kindly to just any explanation. I'm with the agency, he said, his tone flat. But I'm not here on official business. I'm here because of what you're dealing with. This isn't just some random stalker. This goes much deeper than that. Forge's instincts flared, and he moved closer, his body blocking the man's view of Aisha. What the hell do you mean by goes deeper? Who's behind this? The man sighed, his face betraying a brief flicker of concern. I can't say too much, but I'll tell you this. The people you're up against, they're not just dangerous, they're organized. They're part of something bigger, something that reaches much farther than just your town or this motel. They're connected to a network that's been operating under the radar for years, and they don't take kindly to people like you interfering. Forge took a deep breath. This was bigger than he'd imagined. He had always known there was more to the story. There had to be. Nothing about the stalker had made sense. It was too perfect, too calculated. But now, hearing the man's words, it all started to fall into place. The bikers weren't just helping a scared little girl. They were up against something much more dangerous than they could have ever anticipated. So what do you want from us? Forge asked, his tone flat. The man seemed to consider his words carefully. I need you to stop what you're doing, he said, his voice low and serious. I know you've promised to protect her, but this isn't a fight you can win. These people, they'll destroy everything in their path. If you continue down this road, you'll bring them to your door. And when they come, they won't stop. Forge's jaw clenched. He had always known the world wasn't black and white, but this felt like something even more sinister, a shadow looming over everything he'd built with his crew. His gut told him this man wasn't lying, but he wasn't about to back down either. You don't understand, Forge said, his voice low. We don't back down from a fight. I made a promise, and I'm not walking away from it. The man's eyes darkened, and he stepped back. I'm not asking you to back down, he said, his voice tinged with urgency. I'm asking you to be smart. These people are everywhere. They're listening to everything. And they've already started to move. If you don't take this seriously, if you don't get out now, you'll regret it. All of you. Forge was silent for a moment. He could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He knew the stakes. He knew what was at risk. But he couldn't let fear dictate his actions. Not now. Not when a promise had been made. He turned away from the man and looked out the motel window, the dark night stretching out before him. The world outside felt dangerous, uncertain. But in that moment, Forge knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to let Aisha face this alone. He wasn't going to let anyone else get hurt because of him. You can walk out of here if you want, Forge said, his voice firm. But we're not running. We're staying. And we'll face whatever comes next. The man studied him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he shook his head. Then you've made your choice. But know this, the clock is ticking. And when they come, they won't stop until they have what they want. With that, he turned and walked out, leaving Forge to process the weight of his words. Forge didn't say anything at first. He stood there, looking out the window, thinking about what the man had said. The bikers weren't just facing a stalker. They were facing something far more dangerous, something they couldn't prepare for. But he wasn't about to back down. Not now. Not ever. He turned to Aisha, still sleeping peacefully in the corner. She was safe for now, but how long would that last? How long before the people who had been watching her found a way to strike back? Forge's resolve hardened. He had made a promise to her father, and he wasn't about to let that promise go unfulfilled. He had no idea what they were about to face, but he knew one thing. They would face it together. Forge paced back and forth, his mind racing. The words from the stranger echoed in his ears. The clock is ticking, and when they come, they won't stop until they have what they want. His gaze shifted to the small, dimly lit motel room where Aisha was sleeping peacefully, unaware of the danger that still loomed. He couldn't shake the feeling that their fight wasn't over yet. It was only just beginning. The night had been unsettling, but now, Forge had a new sense of urgency. He had made his decision, and there was no turning back. The stranger had been right about one thing. The situation was bigger than he had imagined. These weren't just random threats. They were part of something much larger, something that had been operating quietly for years. Forge couldn't put his finger on it, but the pieces were slowly starting to come together. The bikers had always been a family, a group bound by loyalty and a sense of justice. But this was a different kind of fight. The kind of fight that didn't just involve muscle and intimidation. It involved strategy, patience, and trust. Forge knew his crew would stand by him, but there was no guarantee they'd be enough. He needed to be sure, and he needed a plan. As the minutes ticked by, he thought of the people he had promised to protect, Aisha and her father, Tyrone. Tyrone's voice echoed in his mind. "Look after my little girl, Forge. She's all I have." Forge had made that promise in the heat of battle, and now it was time to honor it. He turned toward the door, his hand hovering over the knob. The air outside was thick with tension, and the stillness of the night only heightened the sense of danger. He opened the door and stepped outside, his boots thudding against the concrete as he made his way toward his bike. His brothers, the Thunderwolves, were already gathering in the parking lot, their motorcycles lined up in a tight formation. The sounds of engines revving filled the air, a comforting noise in the midst of the uncertainty. Forge walked over to the group, his face set in determination. "We're not backing down," he said, his voice low but firm. "We're going to find out who's behind this, and we're going to end it." His words were met with nods of agreement, the bikers stepping forward, their expressions matching his resolve. They were ready. The group quickly formed a plan, strategizing their next move. They couldn't afford to waste time. Forge knew they needed to get ahead of whoever was pulling the strings before it was too late. The first step was to trace the man they had captured, the stalker who had been watching Aisha. They had him for now, but there was no guarantee he would stay quiet. They needed answers, and they needed them fast. Forge turned to his second-in-command, Diesel, a giant of a man who had seen his fair share of danger. "Diesel, you and Phantom check the area where we found him. See if you can find anything that points to who's behind all this." Diesel nodded, already reaching for his keys. "Got it, boss." Forge's mind was already racing through their options. They needed to get Aisha out of this motel. The longer they stayed, the more vulnerable they became. But where could they go? Where could they hide? The biker gang wasn't exactly inconspicuous. They couldn't just disappear into the night like shadows. They were too noticeable, too loud. But Forge knew one thing for sure. They couldn't let Aisha out of their sight. She was the key to everything, and if they could keep her safe, they could stop whatever was coming. As Diesel and Phantom took off to investigate, Forge turned back to the rest of the crew. "We need to stay alert," he said. "And if anyone even looks at Aisha the wrong way, you deal with it. No questions, no hesitation." The bikers nodded again, their faces hardening. This wasn't a time for second guesses. It wasn't a time for mistakes. They were in this together, and nothing was going to tear them apart. Forge mounted his Harley and revved the engine, the growl of the bike a reminder of what was at stake. He glanced at Aisha, still asleep in the room, and his chest tightened. She was safe for now, but the clock was ticking. They needed to move fast, or it wouldn't matter how many bikers they had on their side. Forge took a deep breath and pushed the thoughts from his mind. There was no room for doubt. He had a job to do, and he was going to see it through to the end. The group of bikers pulled out of the parking lot, the sound of their engines reverberating through the empty streets. As they rode into the night, Forge's mind remained focused. They couldn't afford to let their guard down. Someone out there was watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. And when they did, Forge would be ready. The Thunderwolves would make sure of that. A few miles down the road, Diesel and Phantom found something, a hidden cache of weapons, enough to suggest that the stalker wasn't just a random figure. They were dealing with something far more dangerous than anyone had anticipated. This wasn't just about Aisha anymore. It was about survival. It was about taking down an enemy that had been lurking in the shadows for too long. And Forge knew that the next time they crossed paths, there would be no turning back. The night felt colder as Forge led the bikers down the winding road, the headlights of their motorcycles cutting through the darkness. His mind was still racing from the discovery Diesel and Phantom made. The weapons cache, the hidden threats. Nothing was adding up, and yet, everything felt more dangerous with every passing minute. Forge's grip on the handlebars tightened as they approached a small town on the outskirts of the city. This place wasn't on any map, not the kind of place people wanted to be found. It was exactly the kind of location they needed to investigate, but it was also the kind of place that could trap them if they weren't careful. He glanced back at the crew. Each one was alert, their faces set with the same determination. There was no turning back now. Forge had promised to protect Aisha, but it wasn't just her safety that was at stake anymore. He had come to realize that this was bigger than anyone could have imagined. As they rolled into the town, Forge's mind kept coming back to the same thought. Who were these people? Who was pulling the strings behind the scenes? The situation was evolving, and it wasn't just about Aisha anymore. It was about stopping something far larger, something that had been operating in the shadows for years. Forge's thoughts were interrupted when Diesel's voice crackled through his earpiece. "We're in position, boss," Diesel said. "There's a building up ahead. Looks like an old warehouse. We need to check it out." Forge nodded, signaling the crew to slow down. They pulled into a dark alley behind the warehouse, where the lights barely reached. The air was thick with tension, the sense of foreboding growing stronger. This was it. They were about to find out if this was where it all started, or if they were walking into another trap. Forge got off his bike and motioned for the others to follow. They moved quickly, staying out of sight, their boots silent against the cracked concrete. As they neared the entrance, Forge could feel the weight of the moment pressing on him. He could sense that something wasn't right. There was a smell of stale air in the warehouse, the kind that told you this place had been abandoned for years. But there was also the unmistakable sense that someone was watching, waiting for them to make a move. Forge motioned for Diesel and Phantom to cover the entrance while he moved inside. He pushed the door open slowly, the creak of the hinges echoing in the silence. Inside, the warehouse was dimly lit, with dust motes floating in the air. The sound of distant machinery whirring echoed from somewhere deeper in the building. Forge moved cautiously, his senses on high alert. He could hear faint footsteps behind him, the sound of someone moving in the shadows. He turned to his right, his eyes narrowing. "Stay alert," he whispered to the group. As they ventured deeper, the warehouse seemed to stretch endlessly. The rows of crates and boxes seemed to go on forever, but Forge's gut told him that what they were looking for was close. Then, in the far corner, Forge saw something that made his heart race. A small, makeshift office set up among the crates. It looked out of place, almost as if someone had been using it as a base of operations. The curtains were drawn tight, and the door was slightly ajar. Forge motioned for Diesel and Phantom to stay behind while he moved closer. He pushed the door open with one hand, the creak of the hinges sending a chill down his spine. Inside, there was a desk, cluttered with papers, and on the wall, a map of the city with red markings all over it. Forge's eyes scanned the room quickly. There was no one inside, but the place looked like it had been used recently. His eyes landed on a set of files spread out on the desk. He walked over, carefully flipping through them. The documents were filled with information about Aisha, her father, and the bikers. But it wasn't just that. The papers also detailed movements, dates, times, and locations. It was a list of every step they had taken since they arrived. Someone had been following them. Someone had been tracking their every move. Forge's hand tightened around the papers. He knew this wasn't just about Aisha anymore. They had become part of a much larger game, one where their every move was being watched, analyzed. And whoever was behind this knew exactly what they were doing. He felt a sense of urgency rising in him. They had to get out of here now. As he turned to leave, Forge heard the sound of approaching footsteps, heavy boots hitting the concrete floor. His heart raced. It was too late. They were surrounded. He motioned for the others to get into position, ready for whatever was about to happen. The door to the office slammed open, and two men stepped inside. One was tall, wearing a dark suit, and the other was shorter, with a scar running down his face. Both looked like they were part of the same organization that had been pulling the strings. The taller man spoke first, his voice cold and deliberate. "You shouldn't have come here," he said, his eyes narrowing as he looked at Forge. "This is where it ends." Forge didn't flinch. He had no intention of backing down now. "You've been watching us, following Aisha, and you thought you could get away with it." The taller man smiled, but there was no humor in it. "It's not about Aisha. It's never been about her. It's about sending a message." Forge's blood ran cold as he realized what that meant. This wasn't just a personal attack. This was something much bigger. The man stepped forward, and Forge's instincts kicked in. This was the moment. They were at war now, and nothing would stop him from making sure Aisha was safe. He stepped into action, ready for whatever was to come next. The two men stood in the doorway of the makeshift office, their eyes locked onto Forge with cold determination. The tension in the air was thick, palpable, as the sound of their footsteps echoed in the silence. Forge knew they were outnumbered, but he also knew they had the advantage of surprise. He could feel his heart pounding, but his body was calm, focused. He wasn't going to let this end here. Not like this. He glanced at his crew. Diesel and Phantom had already positioned themselves, each one standing ready to act. The two men in front of Forge didn't seem to notice the others, too focused on him. The taller man, his suit impeccably pressed, spoke first, his voice smooth but menacing. "You should have stayed out of this, Forge. You've got no idea who you're dealing with." Forge didn't flinch. He had heard threats like this before. But the way the man spoke, the calm, almost practiced tone, made him realize that these weren't just ordinary criminals. These were people with power, people who had resources far beyond anything they had imagined. "We're not backing down," Forge said, his voice firm, each word carrying the weight of the promise he had made to Aisha and her father. The man smirked, taking a step forward. "You're already in over your head. You think this is about protecting a little girl? This is bigger than that. This is about control, about power. And you're standing in the way of something much larger than your little club." Forge didn't need to hear more. He could feel the danger in the man's words. "You don't scare me," Forge said, his eyes never leaving the man's face. The man's smirk faded, replaced with a look of cold disdain. "You should be scared. Your time is running out, and soon, you'll understand just how far we're willing to go." The tension between them was unbearable, the air thick with the threat of violence. Then, suddenly, Forge heard a faint noise behind him. It was a small sound, but it was enough to make him snap his attention away from the men in front of him. In the distance, he could see the faint outline of a figure moving quietly through the shadows, just outside the warehouse. Forge's instincts flared. It wasn't just the two men in front of him, they had someone else. Someone watching, waiting for the right moment. "We're not alone," Forge muttered under his breath. He signaled to Diesel and Phantom, who immediately moved to cover the entrances. The tension heightened. Forge's hand slid toward the handle of his gun, the metal cold against his palm. He wasn't going to wait for these men to make the first move. He was done with waiting. The man in front of him noticed the movement and chuckled darkly. "You really think you can fight us off? You have no idea what you're up against." Forge's eyes narrowed. He knew this was a gamble, but it was the only one he had. With a quick motion, he drew his gun and aimed it at the man. The taller man froze, his expression shifting from cocky confidence to a more guarded caution. "You don't have to do this," the man said, his tone softer now, trying to regain control of the situation. Forge didn't answer. He wasn't negotiating. The moment had come. The gun in his hand felt heavy, but his grip was steady. He had fought in battles before, but this was something different. This wasn't just about physical strength. It was about protecting the people he cared about. Aisha. Her safety was everything, and he wasn't going to let anyone take that from him. "Who else is out there?" Forge demanded. The man didn't answer immediately. Forge's patience was running thin. "Tell me now." The man slowly exhaled, realizing that Forge wasn't going to back down. "You think we're the only ones?" he sneered. "You're right. You're not alone. But you're outmatched. And when the rest of them show up, you'll see just how out of your depth you really are." Forge's heart skipped a beat. There was more to this than he had thought. These men weren't just out to hurt Aisha. They were part of a much larger operation. This wasn't just about a few people working in the shadows. This was an entire network, and they had been operating for far too long. Forge couldn't help but wonder, how deep did this go? How many others were involved? Just as the man opened his mouth to say more, the sound of motorcycles approaching broke the tension. Forge's eyes widened, and he turned his head toward the noise. It wasn't just his crew anymore. There were more bikes, and they were getting closer. Forge knew that this wasn't going to be a quick fight. They had to get out of here fast. The man in front of him noticed the shift in focus and turned toward the door, his eyes narrowing. "You think help is going to save you? It's already too late." But before the man could make a move, Forge raised his gun higher, his finger tight on the trigger. "Not if I stop you first," Forge growled. The biker gang outside had arrived, their engines roaring as they skidded to a halt, blocking any potential escape. Forge knew it was time. No more running. This fight was coming to them, and they weren't going to let it destroy everything they had fought for. The battle was just beginning, but Forge wasn't about to let these men, whoever they were, take the one thing he had left to protect. He was going to make sure Aisha stayed safe, even if it cost him everything. The sound of approaching motorcycles grew louder, the engines roaring like a storm on the horizon. Forge's grip tightened around the gun, his senses sharpened, ready for whatever came next. His eyes never left the two men in front of him. They were trying to act calm, but Forge could see it in their eyes. They were nervous. They had expected to intimidate him, but they hadn't counted on the Thunder Wolves being ready. Forge's heart pounded in his chest, but his mind was clear. He couldn't afford to hesitate now. He needed to end this before things escalated any further. The biker gang outside had already arrived, their bikes lined up outside the warehouse, engines still rumbling. They had his back. Forge knew the fight wasn't going to be easy, but he had no intention of letting these men walk away. He turned his head slightly to check on his crew, signaling them to stay ready. The two men were still watching him, but their attention was wavering, distracted by the sound of approaching reinforcements. Forge wasn't going to let them regain control of the situation. He took a step forward, his voice steady. "You've already lost. There's no way out for you now." The taller man, the one who had been speaking with such confidence earlier, smirked. "You think you've won? You've walked straight into a trap. You have no idea what you're really up against." Forge didn't flinch. "I know exactly what I'm up against, and I'm not backing down. You don't get to threaten innocent people and get away with it." The man's expression hardened. "You don't know who you're dealing with. We've got people everywhere. You'll be lucky if you make it out of here alive." Forge's resolve didn't waver. He wasn't scared. They could try to intimidate him. They could try to threaten him. But he had something they didn't: determination. He wasn't about to let them walk away from this. "You've been watching Aisha, following her, tracking her, and you thought you could intimidate us into backing off," Forge said, his voice rising. "Well, guess what? You messed with the wrong group of people. And we don't quit." The man chuckled darkly, clearly not taking him seriously. "You really think you can take down an entire network? You're just a group of bikers. What makes you think you have the power to stop us?" Forge didn't answer immediately. He wasn't going to waste his breath on words. Instead, he moved, his body swift and sure, grabbing the man by the collar and slamming him against the wall. The man grunted, but Forge's eyes were burning with intensity. "We're not just a group of bikers," Forge growled. "We're a family, and we fight for each other. That's something you'll never understand." The man struggled to break free, but Forge tightened his grip. "Where's your backup?" Forge asked, his voice a low threat. The man's eyes flickered, and for a moment, Forge saw the fear behind his bravado. "They're not far," the man replied, gritting his teeth. "But it won't matter. You can't stop us." Forge's hand tightened on the man's collar. "We'll see about that." Just as Forge was about to push further, a voice rang out from the doorway. "Forge, get back." It was Diesel, his voice filled with urgency. Forge released the man and turned quickly, his heart racing. He had barely registered the sound of footsteps approaching from behind him when the door burst open. More figures poured in, dressed in dark clothing, moving quickly and efficiently. The two men at the front of the room instantly tensed, their hands shifting toward hidden weapons. But Forge wasn't waiting for them to make the first move. He raised his gun again, ready to defend his crew. "Get out of the way," Forge barked. Diesel, Phantom, and the other bikers immediately positioned themselves between the door and Aisha, forming a protective barrier. Forge's eyes scanned the newcomers. These weren't just random thugs. They were part of something bigger. These people had been following their every move. And now they were here to finish what they had started. The air in the warehouse grew thick with tension. Forge could feel the weight of the moment. This was it. They were outnumbered, but they weren't backing down. "You think you can take us all down?" one of the new men sneered. "You don't know what you're dealing with." Forge didn't respond. He wasn't going to waste time on them. He turned to his crew and gave a subtle nod. It was time to make their move. The bikers didn't hesitate. With the speed and precision that only a tight-knit group could achieve, they moved into action. Forge stayed close to Aisha, ensuring she was protected. The warehouse erupted into chaos, the sounds of boots hitting the concrete floor, of fists connecting with flesh, of motorcycles roaring to life outside. The bikers fought with everything they had. They weren't just fighting for their own survival. They were fighting to protect Aisha, to protect each other, and to end this nightmare once and for all. Forge felt the adrenaline coursing through his veins, but his mind stayed focused. He couldn't afford to lose control now. This wasn't just about taking down a few thugs. This was about taking down a network, a system that had been operating under the radar for far too long. The fight raged on, but Forge knew they couldn't keep it up forever. They needed to end it fast, before more reinforcements showed up. With every punch, every kick, Forge was one step closer to making sure Aisha would never have to look over her shoulder again. The battle wasn't over yet, but Forge was ready. He had made a promise, and he wasn't going to let these people destroy everything he had fought for. The fight inside the warehouse was chaotic, the sound of fists hitting bodies and the sharp crack of boots against concrete filling the air. Forge moved through the chaos with precision, his eyes scanning the room, ensuring that every biker was safe and every threat was neutralized. His mind raced, but his movements were fluid, as if he had been training for this moment his entire life. The enemy was relentless, but they were not prepared for the unity of the Thunder Wolves. Each of the bikers fought with determination, their actions synchronized, protecting one another with a ferocity that only a family could achieve. Forge's gaze flickered to the corner where Aisha was huddled, safe for now, but he could see the fear in her eyes. He knew that she had already seen too much, that her world had already been shattered. But they couldn't stop now. They had to finish this. The tall man, the one who had been trying to intimidate Forge earlier, was still standing, though blood dripped from his lip, and his face was twisted in anger. He tried to make a move toward the door, but Forge was faster. With a swift movement, he blocked his path, gun raised. "You're not going anywhere," Forge said, his voice calm but laced with fury. The man sneered, wiping the blood from his lip. "You think this is over? You've made a huge mistake, biker. You've interfered with something you'll never understand." Forge's grip on the gun tightened. "You've been tracking us, watching Aisha, and now you're telling me we're just supposed to walk away?" The man's eyes narrowed. "You're just pawns in a much bigger game. The people you're up against, they don't lose." Forge wasn't fazed. "We'll see about that." The man stepped back, reaching for something in his jacket, but Forge didn't hesitate. He fired a warning shot into the ceiling. The man froze, his hand trembling slightly. "Move again, and I'll finish this," Forge said coldly. The biker crew wasn't done yet, though. Diesel and Phantom had managed to take down the other men in the warehouse, but there were still more of them outside. Forge could hear the sound of more motorcycles pulling up. It was the backup, just as he feared. The fight was far from over. "Get Aisha out of here," Forge shouted to Diesel. "We'll cover you." Diesel nodded without a word, moving quickly toward Aisha. She was still sitting in the corner, her eyes wide with fear. She hadn't moved since the chaos had started, but now she needed to. "Come on, sweetheart," Diesel said gently, lifting her into his arms. "We're getting you out of here." Aisha clung to him, her body trembling, but she didn't say a word. She was too scared, too confused. Diesel moved quickly, taking Aisha toward the back of the warehouse where the bikes were parked. Forge's focus shifted back to the two men who were still standing in the center of the room. The tension between them was thick, as if the very air was charged with the promise of violence. But Forge wasn't about to let these men go free. Not after everything they had done. The taller man, clearly frustrated by the situation, turned toward his partner, signaling him to make a move. "You can't win this," the man said, his voice rising. "You're outnumbered. The moment you let your guard down, we'll strike." Forge didn't flinch. "You're welcome to try." The man lunged toward Forge, but Forge was ready. He sidestepped quickly, knocking the man off balance. The man crashed into a stack of crates, but quickly regained his footing, pulling out a knife. Forge didn't hesitate. With a quick move, he disarmed the man, twisting his wrist until the knife clattered to the floor. The man looked up at Forge, eyes wide with fury. "You're a fool," he spat. "You don't know who you're dealing with." Forge's voice was calm but deadly. "I don't need to know. I just need to end this." With a final, swift movement, Forge grabbed the man by the collar and shoved him against the wall. "This ends now." The man's eyes flashed with anger, but Forge wasn't intimidated. He pressed harder against him, pinning him to the wall. "Who else is involved? Who are you working for?" The man's expression darkened, but he didn't answer. Forge's patience was wearing thin, and his grip on the man's shirt tightened. He wasn't going to stop until he got answers. But before he could apply more pressure, Diesel's voice called out from behind him. Forge, we need to go. Now. Forge turned toward Diesel, who was already by the back door with Aisha in his arms. She was safe for now, but Forge knew they weren't out of the woods yet. The backup had arrived, and there was no telling how many more were coming. He released the man, watching as he slumped to the ground, his eyes burning with hate. This isn't over, the man muttered under his breath. It's only just begun. Forge didn't respond. He was already moving toward Diesel and Aisha. They didn't have time to waste. Get ready, Forge shouted to the others. We're leaving. Now. As the bikers quickly gathered their gear, Forge felt the weight of what was coming. The fight wasn't over, but this was only the beginning. They had made enemies, and those enemies weren't going to stop until they had what they wanted. But Forge wasn't afraid. He had made a promise, and he wasn't about to break it. Not now. Not ever. The night had turned colder, the wind carrying with it the scent of rain as Forge and the rest of the Thunder Wolves made their way toward the bikes. Aisha was now safely in Diesel's arms, her small body trembling from fear, but her eyes still wide with determination. Forge could feel the weight of the moment pressing on him. They had barely made it out of the warehouse alive, and now they were on the run. The sound of approaching motorcycles filled the air as the rest of the crew mounted their bikes, ready for whatever came next. The fight was far from over. As the group rolled out of the alley and onto the open road, Forge couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The tension between the bikers was palpable. Everyone knew that this was no longer just a fight to protect Aisha. It was about survival. The men they had just encountered were only a small part of something far larger. Whoever was behind this was well organized, and they wouldn't stop until they had what they wanted. The road ahead felt endless, the dark landscape stretching out before them, but Forge's mind was laser-focused. They needed to get to a safe place, but there was no guarantee that anywhere would be safe. As the wind rushed past him, Forge's mind kept drifting back to the two men they had confronted. He had learned enough from them to know they were part of a larger network. But what exactly was this network? What was their true goal? Forge couldn't help but feel like they were being drawn into something much deeper than a simple criminal operation. The thought gnawed at him. The man with the scar had said it himself. The stakes were higher than they had realized. The people behind this weren't just after Aisha. They were after something bigger. Forge's gaze shifted to the rearview mirror. He could see the headlights of the rest of the crew following closely behind, their presence a small comfort in the chaos that was unfolding around them. But Forge knew they couldn't keep running forever. They had to make a stand. It wasn't just about getting away anymore. It was about ending this before it consumed them all. As they turned onto a quieter road, Forge pulled his bike to a stop and signaled the crew to follow suit. The group slowed to a halt, the sound of their engines idling in the stillness of the night. Diesel gently set Aisha down on the ground, her small hands gripping his leather vest as she looked around, her eyes darting from one biker to the next. What's going to happen now? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Forge walked over to her, crouching down to meet her eyes. We're going to make sure you're safe, he said firmly. But we need you to stay close, okay? We're not letting anyone hurt you. Aisha nodded, but Forge could see the fear still in her eyes. The world had changed for her in ways she couldn't possibly understand yet. He wished he could shield her from all of it, but he knew he couldn't. The world was too dangerous. You're with us now, Forge added, standing up straight. And we're not going to let you go. Diesel gave Forge a quick nod, signaling that the rest of the crew was ready. It was time to make their move. We need to move fast, Forge said. Get to the safe house, regroup, and figure out what our next step is. We'll deal with this once and for all. The bikers mounted their motorcycles again, their engines roaring to life as they sped down the road. Forge stayed at the front, his mind still working through the tangled web of threats they were facing. The warehouse was just the tip of the iceberg. There were more enemies out there, more forces working behind the scenes. Forge had no idea who was really pulling the strings, but he knew one thing for sure. They weren't going to stop until they got what they wanted. He glanced at Aisha in Diesel's arms, her face pressed against his leather jacket, looking small and fragile. She had already been through so much. Forge was determined to protect her, no matter the cost. The safe house wasn't far, but every mile felt like a gamble. He kept his eyes scanning the road ahead, every part of him alert. every instinct screaming that danger was close. It didn't take long before they reached the outskirts of town. The safe house was tucked away in a quiet area, a place where they could lay low and plan their next move. It was an old, nondescript building, the kind of place no one would think to look twice at. The bikers rolled up to the entrance, their engines quieting as they dismounted and gathered around the door. Forge gave a quick look around, his eyes still scanning the area. "We're not safe yet," he muttered, his mind racing. Diesel set Aisha down again, and Forge gave him a brief nod. "Stay with her," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Keep her inside. We'll handle the rest." The crew made their way into the safe house, each one taking a position, ready to defend their own. Forge knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. The door shut behind him, and he turned to face the room. He wasn't sure what they were up against yet, but one thing was clear: this was far from over. Whoever was behind the attack on Aisha wasn't going to give up easily, and Forge wasn't going to stop fighting until they did. The air inside the safe house was thick with tension. The bikers had quickly secured the building, but Forge couldn't shake the feeling that it wouldn't be long before someone came looking for them. Aisha was resting in a corner, still shaken from the chaos of the past hours. Diesel sat nearby, keeping a watchful eye on her. Forge knew that his crew was tired, but they couldn't afford to rest yet. This wasn't over. They had entered a game far bigger than they had anticipated, and now they were all in. The door of the safe house creaked open, and Forge turned quickly, his instincts alert. It was Wrench, the club's mechanic, who had been sent to check for any sign of pursuit. He shook his head as he stepped inside. "No sign of anyone following. But they know we're here." Forge's jaw tightened. He was well aware of that. The question wasn't if they knew, they did. The question was how long they had before their enemies made their move. Forge rubbed his hand over his face, trying to clear his thoughts. He had made promises to Aisha's father, Tyrone. He had sworn to protect her, to keep her safe. But as the minutes passed, he realized that this was bigger than he had imagined. The network they were up against wasn't just some group of criminals. They were an organized force, with resources that stretched far beyond anything the Thunderwolves could have anticipated. Forge walked over to the table, where a map of the area was spread out. He traced his finger over the locations marked in red. These weren't random spots. These were places connected to the people they had just crossed. The more he studied the map, the more he realized that these attacks weren't just random acts of violence. This was a coordinated effort. Someone was orchestrating this, and they had been planning it for a long time. "They're not going to stop until they get what they want," Forge muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. Diesel stood up and walked over to Forge, placing a hand on his shoulder. "We knew this wasn't going to be easy," Diesel said. "But we're not backing down. We'll finish this." Forge looked at his crew, his brothers in arms. They had been through countless battles together, but this was different. This wasn't just a fight for survival. It was a fight to protect everything they held dear. Forge nodded, his resolve hardening. "I know," he said, his voice low but firm. "But we need a plan. We can't keep reacting to them. We need to strike first." He turned back to the map, his mind racing. He had been trained to think strategically, but this was a different kind of war. This wasn't a battle on the streets. It was a fight against an invisible enemy that could be anywhere. Forge knew that if they wanted to end this, they had to hit them where it hurt. He turned to the crew. "We need to find the heart of this operation. We take out the head, and the rest will fall apart. They'll scatter, and Aisha will be safe." Wrench stepped forward, looking over the map. "I can trace some of these locations," he said. "Get us closer to their base of operations. If we can hit them hard and fast, we might stand a chance." Forge looked at Wrench, then at the rest of the crew. He could see the determination in their eyes. These were men and women who had faced death before and come out the other side. They weren't afraid. "Get ready," Forge said. "We leave in an hour." Diesel and Phantom immediately began to gather their gear. Wrench and the others began to prepare, checking their bikes, their weapons, and their supplies. Aisha was still sitting in the corner, her eyes downcast, but Forge could see that she was no longer as frightened as before. She had heard the conversation, and she understood. She was part of this now, whether she wanted to be or not. Forge walked over to her, crouching down so that he was eye level with her. "We're going to end this," he said gently. "I promise you, no one's going to hurt you again." Aisha looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mix of gratitude and fear. "I don't want to be afraid anymore," she whispered. Forge nodded. You won't be. We're going to make sure of that. He stood up and walked back to the table, his mind focused on the task ahead. There was no room for failure. This was it. They were going to end this tonight. As the crew finished preparing, Forge took a deep breath, steeling himself for what was to come. The fight had already cost them so much, but it would cost them even more if they didn't finish this now. The world outside was dark, the streets silent. The calm before the storm. Forge knew they couldn't afford to wait. They had to take the fight to their enemies. And they had to do it before those enemies realized what was coming. Let's go, Forge said, his voice steady. The Thunder Wolves were ready. They had made it this far. And now, they were going to make sure Aisha was safe. No matter the cost. The moment Forge stepped outside the safe house, the wind hit him like a slap to the face, sharp and cold. The streetlights ahead illuminated the dark road, casting long shadows across the cracked pavement. The crew was ready, their bikes lined up, engines growling in the silence of the night. Forge looked around at his brothers and sisters, their faces hard with resolve. They had all been through the fire, but now, with Aisha's life hanging in the balance, the stakes had never been higher. This was more than a fight for survival. It was a fight for redemption, for the promise Forge had made. To Tyrone, for the life of a little girl who had seen too much pain already. He mounted his bike and glanced back at Diesel, who was holding Aisha tightly against him, her small hands clutching his jacket. She looked up at Forge, her eyes filled with silent understanding. No words were necessary. She knew the gravity of the moment. Forge revved his engine, and the other bikers followed suit, the sound of their machines rising into the cold night air like a thunderous roar. They were a force, united, and they would stop at nothing to protect Aisha. The plan was simple, but dangerous. They had to find the heart of the enemy's operation, the place where everything had begun. They needed to strike hard and fast, eliminate the leaders, and take control of the situation before the enemy could regroup. But Forge knew better than anyone. Things rarely went according to plan. The ride to their target was tense. The crew rode in formation, alert to every sound, every movement. Forge's mind raced as the miles stretched out in front of him. They couldn't afford to fail. Not now. Not when they were so close. As they approached the outskirts of the city, Forge signaled for the group to slow down. The lights of the city dimmed behind them, and they were left with only the shadows and the sound of their engines. They were nearing their destination, and Forge could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. This was where it all came to a head. Everyone stay sharp, Forge muttered through the intercom. We don't know what we're walking into. Diesel and Phantom nodded, their expressions serious. The safe house had been quiet for too long, and they knew better than to think they were truly safe. The enemy had eyes everywhere, and Forge was ready to face them head-on. As they reached the location, a large industrial complex stood before them, looming in the distance. It looked abandoned, but Forge knew better. This was it, the heart of the operation. He motioned for the crew to stop and dismount. They parked their bikes in the shadows, staying hidden from any prying eyes. We go in fast and silent, Forge ordered. We take out anyone who tries to stop us. Get in, get out. The crew moved with precision, their movements synchronized. Forge led the way, his eyes scanning the area as they approached the front entrance of the complex. The doors were cracked open, a faint light spilling out from inside. They weren't alone. Forge's instincts were on high alert. The enemy was waiting, and they were ready for a fight. He signaled to Phantom and Diesel to move around the back, while the rest of the crew covered the front. Forge's heart raced as they neared the entrance. They couldn't afford to hesitate. The doors creaked as he pushed them open, the sound echoing through the empty building. Inside, the air was thick with dust, and the smell of oil and rust lingered in the air. Forge moved quietly, his boots barely making a sound on the concrete floor. They were in enemy territory now. He could hear voices in the distance, low murmurs that made his skin crawl. It was clear the operation was in full swing. He motioned for the others to spread out. The crew moved like shadows, each one taking up a position to ensure they weren't caught off guard. Forge could feel the adrenaline building in his chest. This was it. The time for waiting was over. The enemy was here, and it was time to finish this. As they moved deeper into the building, Forge's eyes locked onto a door at the far end of the room. There was something behind that door, something important. He could feel it. He signaled for Diesel and Phantom to move in and cover him. They nodded and moved silently into position. Forge took a deep breath and approached the door. His heart beat louder in his ears as he reached for the handle. He could hear the faint sounds of movement on the other side, the unmistakable sound of someone waiting. Forge steeled himself. He wasn't about to let fear take control. He kicked the door open, his gun raised, ready for whatever was behind it. The room was dimly lit, filled with crates and boxes. But what caught Forge's attention wasn't the clutter. It was the figure standing in the corner. The man who had been pulling the strings. The leader of the operation. The man they had been hunting. He was standing there, calm and composed, like he had been expecting them. "I was wondering when you'd show up," the man said, his voice smooth, almost casual. Forge didn't flinch. He was done with games. "It's over," he said, his voice low and steady. "You're not getting away." The man smirked. "You really think you can stop this? You've already lost." Forge's hand tightened around the gun. "No. This ends tonight." The man took a step forward, his eyes narrowing. "We'll see about that." The air in the room was thick with tension. The final showdown was about to begin. The tension in the room was palpable, as Forge stood face to face with the man who had orchestrated it all. The leader of the operation, the one who had been pulling the strings behind the scenes, was finally here. Forge's grip on his gun tightened as he stepped forward, his eyes locked on the man, who didn't seem at all rattled by the confrontation. He wasn't afraid. He didn't think they could win. But Forge wasn't about to back down. "You think you've won, don't you?" the man said, a smirk playing on his lips. "You've been chasing ghosts. You've been led into this trap, and now it's too late." Forge didn't flinch. "It's never too late to end it," he said, his voice low, but carrying a firm promise. The man laughed softly, the sound hollow and cold. "You think you can take us down? You're nothing but a bunch of bikers. You don't stand a chance against us." Forge stepped closer, his voice steady but filled with resolve. "We're not just a bunch of bikers. We're a family, and that means we fight for each other, for the people we love, and we never back down." The man's smirk faltered for a moment, but he quickly regained his composure. "You're all fools. You have no idea what you're really up against. You've only scratched the surface of what we've been building." Forge shook his head. "I don't need to understand everything. I just need to make sure you don't hurt anyone else. You've already crossed too many lines." The man's eyes narrowed, and his hand twitched slightly, like he was about to make a move. But Forge was ready. He had come this far, and there was no turning back now. "You're not leaving this building," Forge said, his gun still aimed. "Not unless it's in handcuffs, or worse." The man's eyes flickered, a hint of fear betraying his otherwise confident facade. He must have realized that Forge wasn't bluffing. "You think this is the end?" he spat, his tone now laced with panic. "There are more of us. You won't even make it out of here alive." Forge stepped closer, his voice calm, but unyielding. "I've heard enough of your threats. It's over. You're done." Just as Forge took a step forward, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed from behind him. He turned to see Diesel, Phantom, and the rest of the crew stepping into the room. Their expressions were hard, their movements coordinated as they took their positions around the building. The man's eyes widened in realization. He had underestimated them. Forge's crew was more than ready. "You're surrounded," Forge said, his voice like steel. "Give it up. You're not going anywhere." The man's eyes flickered from one biker to the next, but his bravado had completely evaporated. He was trapped. He tried to take a step back, but Forge was too quick. With one swift motion, Forge grabbed him by the collar and slammed him against the wall. "I'm done talking," Forge growled. "You've hurt too many people, and you're not going to hurt anyone else." The man struggled, but Forge's grip was unyielding. "This is where it ends," Forge said. The man stopped struggling and sneered. "You think you've won? You don't even know the half of it. You're just one small part of something much bigger." Forge's eyes narrowed. "That's enough," he said, his voice deadly. "It ends here now." He turned to Diesel, who had been watching the exchange with a steely gaze. "Get him in cuffs. We're taking him in." Diesel nodded and quickly moved forward to restrain the man, securing him with the help of Phantom. Forge stepped back, surveying the room. His eyes lingered on the other bikers, each one of them looking back at him with the same resolve. They had done it. They had taken down the enemy's leader, and with him, the rest of the operation would soon crumble. Aisha was safe now, and that's all that mattered. But even as Forge allowed himself a moment of relief, he knew this wasn't the end. The man had been right about one thing. Their enemies were bigger than they had realized. They were part of something much more dangerous, but now, they had a chance to dismantle it from the inside out. Forge turned to Aisha, who had been watching the entire confrontation from the back of the room, her eyes wide. Diesel and Phantom had already moved her out of harm's way, but she was still a part of this fight. Forge walked over to her, kneeling down to her level. "You're safe now," he said, his voice gentle. Aisha nodded, but her eyes were still filled with uncertainty. She had seen too much in such a short time. "Are you okay?" Forge asked. Aisha looked up at him, her voice barely above a whisper. "Will they come after us again?" Forge's heart clenched. He didn't want to lie to her, but he had to protect her from fear. "We'll make sure they don't," he promised. He looked over at his crew. They had won this battle, but the war wasn't over yet. They still had work to do. The leader was just the first piece to fall, and Forge was ready to see the rest of this operation destroyed. No matter how long it took, the bikers were more than ready to finish what they started. "We'll keep you safe," Forge said, looking back at Aisha, and then to his brothers and sisters. "We're a family, and we fight for each other. Always." As the crew began to regroup and prepare for what was next, Forge knew that the road ahead would be long and filled with challenges. But they had made it this far, and they weren't about to stop now. The mission was clear. The Thunderwolves would fight until the end to protect those who couldn't protect themselves, no matter the cost. I have come across many compelling Hell Angel stories, but none as intense and gripping as this one. It's a tale of loyalty, strength, and survival, featuring a group of bikers who will stop at nothing to protect those they love. The story takes place in a world of danger, where a young girl named Aisha is caught in a deadly game, surrounded by enemies who want to use her for their own gain. These Hell Angel stories show the true power of unity, as Forge and his crew fight to take down a dangerous criminal network while facing overwhelming odds. The plot thickens as the group races against time, battling not only the enemies in front of them, but the fear of what might be lurking in the shadows. These Hell Angel stories not only showcase intense action, but also the personal struggles each biker faces, bringing them together in the most trying of circumstances. As the fight intensifies and the danger grows, the bikers must rely on their unbreakable bond to protect Aisha and take down the ruthless forces targeting her. It's clear that the road ahead will be perilous, but in the end, it's the strength of their family that will determine their fate in these Hell Angel stories. As the final showdown looms, the bikers are ready for whatever comes next, knowing that the fight isn't just for survival. It's for something much more important, the promise of safety and justice.